All right, welcome back to another episode of Eurotrack, where I'm joined by co-host Katie Schide. In this episode, we are previewing the 126K race at Transgrancanaria, which I am very, very excited about. The more I research and talk to people and generally get a sense of what it's all about and where it fits into the scene, it's just so cool. And Katie, you are actually over there right now, I believe, getting ready to race the VK. What are your initial impressions of the environment and the vibes pre-race, pre-festival?
Yeah, well, it's good to see you again, Finn, even though I'm in a different place than normal. But yeah, it's fun to be actually on site here for this, although I wish we could have caught up after the race when I have even a better sense of the race. But yeah, I would say first impressions are similar to some of the other Canary Islands that I've visited. This is my first time on Gran Canaria.
Yeah.
But a little less vegetated than Tenerife or something like Madeira, which is not a Canary Island, but a little farther north, and there's a lot more vegetation there. Although I've only been in one part of the island so far, and I've been told that there are more trees and vegetation in other areas. So first impression, classic, great Spanish welcome. Everyone's happy. There's sun. It's warm. I think everyone's just kind of happy to be outside in t-shirts and shorts and kind of relaxing a bit.
It's really interesting, the timing of the year for this race. I've heard secondhand from people like Nuria Picas, who says that Transgrancanaria is this huge race for Spanish ultra runners. And I think generally it is a big race on the European calendar in general. But then you run into this sort of conundrum where if you are a two-sport athlete, if you are a skier, if you have a skimo season, this is just an awkward time of the year to train if you can train at all specifically. Is that sort of the vibe you get as well? Like it does attract, talented runners, but there is sort of a split, and there are runners that like might sign up for UTMB that just aren't there, like yourself in February.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of a mix of different things. Yeah, what I was saying before we hit record was that what Transgrancanaria has going for it is that it's in February,
Yeah.
but that's also what it has working against it. So it's an interesting position to be in because they're not competing with any other major race right now. It's not like the Western States Lavaredo 90K du Mont Blanc weekend.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for a race in this time period, this is the race to do. But if you're someone who's targeting bigger races later in the season,
Yeah.
I think it doesn't fit in a traditional sort of build up where maybe you do a 50 or 100K in the spring and then maybe look at a longer race like UTMB later in the summer, or even Western State. Well, I guess it could maybe work for Western States, but it's honestly almost the same amount of time as Western States. It's in the same time range. But yeah, I would say for most of the athletes in the Alps, it doesn't, not just because someone is necessarily a two-sport athlete. There actually aren't that many people who are really two-sport athletes who are really competing at the highest level of trail running and competing at actually the only person competing at the highest level of World Cup skimo racing and trail running is Remy Bonnet.
Yeah. True.
So of course, World Cup isn't the only type of skimo racing. Like, for example, the reason that my partner Jarmo is not here is because he's preparing for longer races like Pyramenta or Tour de Retour. Someone like Francois or there's a lot of French athletes who are still doing ski races, but maybe not at the same level at which they compete at trail running races. But beyond that, I would say it's just really hard to train in the Alps for running in the winter because you can't run. We don't have like packed snow trails like you find in the US. So you're either on skis or you're running on a road or a treadmill or somewhere at the bottom of the valley. It's not that interesting. So I would say people are like saving their, kind of peak form or like real dedicated motivation for later in the year, or they just don't want to be training that much in December, January, because those are the race is now, but you have to think back like 2-3 months to when people
Right.
would begin training for this. So that would be, November until now, which I would say traditionally is kind of like the off time.
That's the theme of late too on the show. Like we just did a bunch of content around the Black Canyon 100K, and to a lesser extent, American runners deal with that challenge too, of the trade-offs of like, when do I start my season? How much time do I have in my schedule to work backward from that race and sort of be ready to compete at an elite level? It's an interesting challenge. A couple other sort of notable points that I came across just in research and having followed the race for a couple of years now. It's been on my radar since I Run Far. I mean, Brian and Megan have been going over there for many, I think dating back to like 2014 or 2015. Like I just watched a old Anton Krupicka pre-race interview for the event from 2015, which was cool. This is truly an international race. On the website, they said there are 60 to 70 nationalities represented every single year, which is amazing. I don't know how that compares to other global races like UTMB. Maybe close to par there, but that's exceptional. There will be a live stream this year, so we'll link to that in the show notes. I watched it last year; it was excellent. And then it's also, I think, new this year. It's part of the World Trail Majors, which, if people are not familiar yet, brings together sort of a bunch of bucket list races across the world, like Ultra Trail Cape Town, Black Canyon, Hong Kong 100K. And then in this series, for like the top athletes that we'll talk about in a moment, their best 2 results from inside the series count towards their ranking, and the top 20 in each of these races get points. So that's cool. There's prize money as well. Are there any other sort of like just notables about the race, the culture that excite you before we kind of get into like course stats and analysis?
Yeah, I would just say in general, it is a pretty big race, definitely in Spain. I wouldn't put it at the same level as the importance of Diagonal des Fous in France, but up there. Like, I think it gets a ton of coverage on the Spanish media that we probably miss, even in France, because of the language difference, and obviously in the US. So, yeah, for the Spanish trail running media community, definitely a super big race. And it's something we always follow in France too. I mean, it's really kind of, it feels like the start of quote unquote season of ultra running. It's kind of where everyone, it feels like the first big race that you follow, kind of. I don't know if that explains it well enough. I guess Black Canyon this year, because obviously I was following that a little bit closer because I know a little bit more about the American running scene. But this is kind of the big like mountain ultra, that the first one that everyone starts following. And it used to be part of Ultra Trail World Tour back in the day. So that was something we followed at that time too.
Maybe one last thing for me. This is sort of a nerdy marketing shout out to the World Trail Major Transgrancanaria teams, but I loved those Instagram like phone notifications that they made for athletes like you, introducing like, we've just brought this athlete in to do the race. I thought those were pretty unique, and it kind of stopped me in my scrolling tracks. That was well done.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah. That was humorous.
But yeah, moving on to sort of like course analysis, I love these kinds of races where you have a route that logically traverses a geographic feature. Like the obvious one for me is Mount Blanc with UTMB, that just makes like logistical sense. In this case, it's an entire island, happens at Transvolcania too, other races. You get to travel to a foreign land. That's awesome. There's high level competition. You still run long, but it's not quite the pounding of like 100-mile mountain effort. So that's all pretty cool. I made a couple calls to like Tyler Green, Jimmy Elam, Mike McMonagle, people that have done the race that kind of gave me really good course intel. But you're there on the ground. Before I kind of get into my notes, is there anything about this course that really immediately comes to mind for you that you want to share with the audience?
No, I would say the first thing is what interests me about the race is that it is a logical route, and that's something I appreciate about races. It's something that I actually look for when I'm like signing up for a race, is like, is this just some squiggles around in circles to make an exact 100-mile, 100K route, or is this something that actually makes sense? And yeah, there are great examples of that, like UTMB, Maxi Race. All of the island crossing races are usually in that same style. So yeah, that's something I'm excited about. I think it just makes sense. And yeah, instead of just trying to hit a certain number of kilometers or miles, it feels more like there's an objective.
If for anyone out there, like viewers and listeners that watched the live stream in past years, you know how cool the course is. You'll recognize like there's famous checkpoints like Terror and Artenera and Tejada, and that summit, I think it's called Roque Nublo. If I mispronounced that, I apologize. Where you can, on clear days on the live stream, you can see the whole island, which is super cool. It's the island is right. It's Gran Canaria, off the coast of like the northwestern African continent. So like Morocco's nearby, Western Sahara is nearby for reference point. I think the environment is super interesting and just like different at various points. Like you start and finish on beaches by the ocean, and then like terrain wise and scenery wise, it's pretty strikingly different throughout. Like it can be volcanic in some areas, it can be very forested and alpine in other areas. Throughout, it's pretty rocky. I was talking with Tyler Green last night, and he said like there is this arid feel to it, there is this volcanic feel to it, but then like you do get to points like in the middle 50K section where there's a bunch of up and down climbing where it gets very like Pacific Northwest temperate rainforest type vibes. So yeah, I mean those are some of the immediate like takeaways on the course from me. But I think the other thing, and this is where I would love to get your take, is like it's a midnight start. I know you have a lot of experience with this type of start time from your efforts at Lavaredo. Do you find this to be challenging and debilitating in any way, or do you see it as more of an advantage where you have less darkness to work with and you can kind of like finish firmly in the second half in daylight?
Yeah, first I would say I was also in the car with Caitlin Gerben this morning, and she echoed the same reviews as Tyler, that it's kind of a mix of everything. You got to run in some places, you have to hike in some places, and it's constantly changing. So yeah, it's not really defined by one type of running, really, I guess. But for the question about the night start, yeah, this is one of the special races where, at least for the first men, half of the race is at night. And then after that, it's almost half the race is still at night for the next people. So yeah, it makes it pretty particular because you start having not slept for maybe more than, a whole day. And in some ways that's super hard. In some ways, some people really like that because it does bring a lot of energy to the start, because the Spanish stay up really late anyway. So they're basically all partying in the streets at the start. Apparently the start is insane. I will witness it for myself this weekend, but I've heard that it's a huge party. So that's a plus side. Otherwise you have to be really comfortable with night running and be okay with that. Like I often find that midnight to sunrise is kind of the hardest part of an overnight race, like something like UTMB. And so you kind of start at that worst time period. So you have to be able to get through that and then get through the next day too. So it's actually quite tricky if it's not something you're used to. But because you start at midnight, the night actually isn't that long. Like you're not doing a full, 10, 12 hours. I think the sunrise this morning was around 7. So they're going to have like 7 hours.
7 hours, yeah.
In the dark. So the sunrise is never that far away, but you're also kind of in that tough part of the night.
And it also seems like that, just based on like the Strava profiles I looked at and some of the splits, it seems like that first 20 to 30K, that like 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. time span, that's like the one part of the race where if you did train for turnover, like that's the one place you need running economy. I saw a lot of the lead men, lead women last year running like at or below 6-minute pace for the first like 13 to 15 miles. It was pretty wild. And like some people will push harder in this section because it's less like the roller coaster climbs and descents in the middle part. You're kind of like gradually working your way towards the mountainous sections in that like logical way we were kind of highlighting earlier. So interesting that like when I look at the first like 30-40K of the race, it's that like if you were going to be training running economy, that's where you'd want it. But then moving into like the middle part of the course, the part that I know Caitlin talked about in her her 20, I think it was her 2020 post I Run Far interview when she won the race. Like that was the section that she really took advantage of. She made her moves to ultimately win the race. And similar to what Tyler said, environment wise, you start to get into like that conifer section. There's a lot more green, a lot more moisture, and it's roller coaster like. So I love that, like, and we can talk about this, now if we want, but like I love that for this race, you have to be a complete competent trail runner. Like there are times to hike, there are times to run. You need to have downhill legs in that last part. Like you need to have every single part of your system as an elite athlete firing to be successful here. It doesn't weigh throughout the race into any particular skill set, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, and Courtney also said the same thing about the first, 30. It looks like around the first 30K. She said it was a lot of just kind of getting out of the coastal villages, cities. And it was a lot of like dirt road, fast running, not that interesting. So maybe it's fine that it's at night. Actually, they're not missing that much. And she said until maybe the first 30K is when you really start maybe the more traditional trail running. So, I think that is where people can either burn themselves out or conserve energy if they're already skilled at running fast. So that makes sense to me.
I remember in our last episode, we were talking about Grand Raid and her performance there and how effectively she came to the race and on-sighted it with little to no recon. Do you know whether she's spent much time on the course either this year in prep or ahead of last year's event, or is she just this like supremely talented runner who can on-site and register just amazing performances?
I don't know how much she's been on the course this year. She's definitely been on the island, so I'm sure she's been on parts of it. And then, of course, she did the race last year, so
yeah,
that's a big recon in one go. But you don't often remember things from the race itself, especially when it's at night.
Yeah.
I imagine she's been on parts of the course. I mean, there's a lot of trails here, but it would make sense to see some of it again. And a lot of the course is actually already on some of the more scenic trails, so it makes sense. And apparently they haven't changed. They only changed like a 3K section this year.
Okay.
It might be a little bit faster. Apparently it's missing a small climb.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. And it does seem like there have been small but somewhat significant changes like year over year, and it's hard to kind of compare.
I think it's really hard. It's really hard to compare times from any trail race ever. I personally think that like course records are not really that relevant, and because almost every race changes their route even by a little bit, and even when you see it on just if you were to write out the stats, it doesn't match how that affects the time. Like for example, Mute, they changed the route I think 2 years ago, and the final stats are very similar, but the newer course runs significantly faster because they just the way that they moved the trail and the type of trail it took. So I find it really hard to speak about course records when these races are constantly changing small pieces and you don't know what the weather is. And but anyway, that's a side note.
I think it's really interesting. No. I think do you think, not to go too far off, but do you think that generally it should be less of a talking point in preview episodes to focus on times from past years and historical performances and maybe lean more into like the interplay between runners and just general competition?
Yeah, for sure. I don't think like for sure in some circumstances you could say, okay, if it's generally the same course, maybe it's different by a little bit and somebody's time is 2 hours faster, then of course that makes sense. But when we're comparing something down to like even half an hour, 20 minutes, that's for me, it's still within the range and it doesn't make sense to say that it's, course record. Even a race like UTMB, which technically is supposed to be the same race route every year, they actually change it every year. There should be no talk of this is my hot take. There should be no talk of course records at UTMB because
we're clipping this.
Yeah, cut this out. People are gonna not like me. There shouldn't be talk of course record at UTMB. It changes all the time. Every year they make small changes.
Mm-hmm. Cool. No, I've made a note maybe to bring this up in a future long run archives episode. But the one last part of the course that I want to mention, because to me this is actually the most interesting part of the course. In my opinion, it's probably one of the hardest things to train for. But like the last 30 to 40K ish, it's characterized by like extremely long and technical descending. I think with few exceptions, it's harder than anything most American runners will do on a regular basis in training on their home turf. It's super long descent. I think it's in most years it's broken up by a few short, like 500 to 600 foot climbs, but generally it's pretty bonkers. Like if you don't have the like the eccentric leg strength for it, you're pretty screwed. And you also have to be pretty mentally engaged too, because from what like Tyler was saying and Jimmy was saying and Mike, like every step is pretty consequential. It's this mix of like awkward steps, these like baby head rocks, you're in and out of these pretty uneven creek beds. So to be able to run those last like 12 to 15 miles of pretty technical descending after climbing 18 to 20,000 feet of vert in the prior 60 miles, like that, I don't know how you train that, in preparation. So it's an amazing feat to have seen someone like, Tyler Green close so hard last year and work his way into third place after just like putting in all that work in the first, 12, 13 hours. So I don't know if you have thoughts there, but like this to me, it's almost like Transvolcania too. It just, the ability that I see in some runners in that last part of the race just blows me away.
Yeah, I would say I have heard of this infamous last part. I think you're speaking of like the last, what did you say, the last like 30 or 40K? But
yeah,
the part that's more infamous, at least before I'd even come here or like heard that much about the race, was that there's this super long dirt road section in the sun to come back down to the finish line. And apparently that just like cooks people. Yeah. And this is a place you really have to be able to hold it together because you can easily lose positions if you go from running fast to jogging or just trying to survive. So I have heard about this very last section. Before that, yeah, it is because you do cross the island. There is a point where you get to the high point and then it's net downhill to the finish line. Yeah. I would say something like Transvolcania is a little bit, I don't want to say easier, just different because it is basically downhill, maybe with like a few little climbs in the middle. And there seems to be at least a couple sections where you need to be able to hike again. But yeah, I was asking Caitlin how she would describe how technical the trails are here. Of course, she has like better insight on what an American audience would call technical. And she said she would personally not describe it as super technical, but that for an American runner, this would be technical. So somewhere in between very technical and not technical at all, I guess. Very wide range. But yeah, no, I mean, the thing with a downhill though in the second half is that you don't need to then run again. So you can kind of destroy your legs and then you're done. You don't have to do this huge downhill and then also be able to go back uphill and downhill again. So in a way, it almost favors winter running because you can kind of just go for it at the end. In theory, I'm speaking from someone who has zero experience at this race. So maybe people with experience would disagree. But in general, if you're just doing your huge downhill bout at the end of the race, it's not quite the same as if it's in the middle. The next day will be painful, but at least the performance at the end hopefully won't suffer as much.
A couple other interesting factors. Even though it's a mountain race, it only tops out at about 5,600 feet, which I don't do public math typically, but I think that's like 1,800 meters. Is that about correct? 1,800?
Yeah, it would be something like that. Yeah.
So elevation's not really a factor.
No.
And then I think one of the benefits of it being a midnight start is for the lead men and women, I think the majority of the race will be in the dark and also in the early morning hours when the sun is not much of a factor. So maybe you don't need to be as heat acclimated as you would for a Western state. So I think there are some like reprieves in that sense compared to like just some of the general challenges of the course. Yeah, so just interesting race all around, like course wise. Before I get into some stats, any other just final thoughts on just like the course itself and things to kind of like look out for?
Nothing specific. Yeah, it's kind of just an ultra with everything, and yeah, and it seems like a great race, and I'm really excited to be there for it this weekend. Maybe I'll convince myself I need to train through December, January next year.
Couple stats here from our friend Aid Station Fireball, who we will link their Twitter in the show notes. But American pro runner history here is pretty mixed. On the women's side, we've mentioned Courtney and Caitlin. They won in 2020 and 2023 respectively. Abby Hall took second here in 22. On the men's side, it's been more mixed. We've seen podiums from Dylan Bowman and Tyler Green in recent years, also Tim Olson, but also like lots of drops or tough days from other strong contenders like Hayden Hawks, Tim Tollefson, Jared Hazen. And on that side, like no American male has ever won or taken second here. So similar to UTMB, it's been sort of the narrative that I would say the women have had generally more success here. It is like you were saying earlier, it's tough to compare the race year over year just because the course does change in bits and pieces. Yeah, I've got some stats on sort of like the winning moves and where this race is competitive, but just any general thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the style of race that would maybe better highlight the skills of someone from the Alps. Of course, the Spanish runners always are very strong there. So, yeah, I think the women, the American women, have continued to show up and compete at the highest level. But I mean, we had Tyler Green on the podium last year, and I think it's also just it's catching on a little bit more. Although I know that Dylan had he came more than once, I believe. Yeah. So I feel like it's been on the radar, but I think the Spanish are maybe in a way more motivated because it is a bigger race here. Maybe it's taken a little bit more as like a target race as opposed to like, oh, just my first race of the year. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see this weekend how that plays out.
Trying to extend, because this race is 126 kilometers, trying to extend it out to like a full 100 or like 160, 170 kilometers. I'm amazed at how fast this race runs for the lead men and women, just given the challenges. Like, I think we're going to probably see the men's winner run somewhere around sub 13:30. I think if Courtney wins this race, it'll probably be somewhere, below 15 hours. And if we extended that out, I think you would see like sub 17 finishes on the men's side, sub 18 and a half, 19 on the women's side. So it's a slower race than like Western states if you extended it out to the distance, but slower than UTMB. Does that surprise you at all that like this, given the challenges, it's sort of like caught in between like a runner's trail race and like a true mountain race where, that versatility between hiking and running is required?
Yeah, I think it's a little particular because I would say it's more technical than UTMB. But the terrain is less steep, so you can still run a lot more of the climbs. Yeah, it's kind of what we keep saying. It's sort of this like hybrid of some runnable stuff, some technical stuff, some like longer climbs. But from what I've heard, it's never sustained. It's never a really long sustained climb. Even in kind of a longer climb that we would see on the profile, there'll be like small ups and downs in the middle. So you can kind of keep a faster rhythm. But this is also what Caitlin told me, is that this can also burn people because when you reach those sections where you do need to run, you need to be able to run. It's not, you can't just keep walking through a flat section in the middle of your hiking climb. So you kind of have to keep being able to push and like change your speed. And I think that it favors the people who are able to stay in it, like mentally and physically, of course. But I think you have to be basically ready to run at all times. You can't just kind of like death march it until you feel better again.
Great points. Yeah. A couple of the stats here. I think just given historical trends, we should expect the median top 10 men's time to be somewhere around 14:25, 14:30. On the women's side, 17:30 to 17:45-ish. On the podiums, we should see like 30 to 45 minute spreads respectively. Historically, in terms of winning moves at the race, if we're pegging Courtney as the favorite on the women's side, and someone like a Shen Zhongshang or Zach Miller or Andreas on the men's side, I think on the women's side we're going to see, just based on historical data, a move made pretty early, like within 80K of the race, whereas a lot of the men's winners historically have made that winning move just before or just after Roque Nublo, about 90 to 100K in. So I find that really interesting. And then, I think just those are the two other stats that I wanted to highlight. Was there anything else in the data that you found to be interesting that we should mention?
No, I think you highlighted all the points that we have in our nice little data sheet. But yeah, my prediction would be that Courtney will take the lead. If not from the start line, she'll wait, I don't know, maybe 20K and then be in the lead the rest of the race. Yeah. And for the men, this race is actually quite interesting to follow always every year, because it does shake out a lot from the first aid stations until that middle point, or that 80K point, where it starts to get more technical, daylight. That's kind of when people either start to fall apart or find a second wind. So I think for the men, we'll see it. There's going to be a ton of moving around until that 80K-ish. And then even after that, you still see the top 1, 2, 3 will kind of settle out around there. But then after that, you see people moving around a ton on those like final descents in the sun that you described.
Let's talk about the women's field. So storylines, who's in it, analysis, predictions. I'll just leave with the fact that, looking at the ITRA index scores for this race, there's 14 women in the field with a 670 or above ITRA index. So I think this is a pretty deep race. Looking at like contenders for podium and top 10, who sticks out for you? What are some interesting storylines attached? Stuff like that.
Yeah, Courtney, I think she's covered enough. We know who she is. She won last year. She has experience here. I think it's a pretty clear favorite. Beyond Courtney, we have, actually this is going to be interesting, because I think the competition for those spots likely behind Courtney is actually quite tight. Azara and Claudia, of course, stand out. I would peg them as like probably the favorites for the podium. Although, I know Azara, I've raced with her before, and she's been in the sport for a long time. She knows this race. She knows the island. I did just like quickly check her Instagram to make sure she was actually coming, and saw that she did a 30K race last weekend, which I find interesting. By last weekend, I mean 2 days ago. So I don't know if that was part of her plan and she just did it as like a fun training race, but it stuck out to me as an interesting choice. And Claudia actually, speaking to the like skimo athletes, Claudia actually did some World Cup skimo races for Spain this winter, not that long ago. And I was texting her actually a few weeks ago when she was at some of the skimo races. She was at European champs this year, and she was asking me which race I was doing here, and I said the VK, and she was like, "Oh, that's a smarter choice." So I think she's maybe a little hesitant about maybe where her running legs are, but I know
Yeah.
that she can train at home. She lives in Catalonia and can run from home. But she has been doing quite a bit of skiing, so that's something to keep in mind, and maybe it'll help her a bit in some of the climbing parts. But hopefully, she's got some downhill legs under her too. And yeah, and then beyond that, a whole bunch of women who I think there's just a lot of women kind of at a similar level. So I think it will be really interesting to see how they play off of each other, and
Yeah.
if there's some like groups that form and where they all end up. I feel like some of the Americans might know Dominika because
Yep.
she got a golden ticket at Black Canyon 2 years ago. Polish runner, seems to kind of specialize in like faster, flatter running. So who knows? Like I haven't seen anything from her super recently. But she's been here before. She did the marathon a few years ago. So yeah, someone who will be in the mix. And then beyond that, yeah, you have Yuri, the Japanese runner, who's also been around a while. She was third at OCC in like 2019. She has some good results. She also has some like looks like harder race experiences. So yeah, beyond that, my next like the other women I'm kind of interested in seeing is, of course, Ida, my teammate. She's just kind of started getting into longer distances the last 2 years. She was kind of focused more on like marathon distance through 2021, and then in 2022 won the Nice 100K. That was the first year of the race, so that was like a great start for her in kind of the longer stuff. I don't think she's done, I think she has one race experience that started in the night or was overnight. So we'll see how that can be pretty tricky for a first one or two times. So we'll see how it works out for her. And she was actually here last year for the 80K and twisted her ankle while warming up for the start of the race.
Oh my
So
gosh.
some bad luck there. But yeah. Yeah, she had a solid year last year, so I think she's coming off of a good summer last year. Yeah, and then the other two that I wanted to point out was Dominique and Sophie, who have both raced here before, both placed in the top 10. Dominique was fifth in last year, and Sophie Grant was ninth in 2022. Both have like a lot of great results within 1 through 10 in top competitive ultra races, so they're always in the mix, and I think they're reliable top 10 finishers. Yeah, consistent. I would say they're going to be there in the top 10. So awesome. That's my brief overview. I don't know what you found.
Well, I like Claudia a lot. I think she was on the podium in 2022 right behind Abby Hall, so I think I weight that pretty significantly, that even if she had like a suboptimal build up to this race, she's a proven success here, knows the course well, has reconned it in that sense.
Actually, I think it was last year she was third behind Jasmine.
Last year 23. Okay,
and only like, if I'm remembering correctly, only like 6 or 7 minutes behind Jasmine. So, yeah. So yeah, she definitely was like in the race last year.
Yeah, I know the Courtney story is retold a lot. I think just looking at her position in the overall race last year, looking at splits, I think early on she was in the mid-20s overall, got to the mid-teens by mid-race, ultimately to finish 7th overall. So just that progression throughout the race, just textbook. It seemed like she just got stronger as the race went on, didn't deal as much with attrition. So I just am excited to see what kind of dent she can make in the overall top 10 again this year. Hopefully improving on last year's effort.
Yeah, I would predict to see her in the top. I mean,
maybe 5.
My stretch prediction is she's definitely in the top 10. Yeah. Yeah. We'll see how, I think a lot of that will also be determined on how much the men sort of kill each other in the first half of the race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the runner that I am maybe the most fascinated by just on how they've constructed their schedule and their experience is Emma Stewart. So one thing that I find interesting is she took third at Lavaredo last year. So importantly, she has experienced that midnight start similar to Transgrancanaria. Before Lavaredo, 5 weeks before it, she won the Ultra Trail Snowdonia 100 miler, which is a brutally technical race, which tells me if she can handle that type of terrain, she should be okay at TGC. After Lavaredo, she won Tour de Géant. So she's multifaceted. Like she can do these like extended multi-day things. And then she came out to the island, I believe in December of this past year, and reconned the entire course. And she has this Instagram post where she's like, I didn't know going in that this course basically had no running water on it. I think she started each day with like 1.5 liters of water, and she was, pulling off like 20 to 30 mile days in succession. So she's just a tough runner. She's super into orienteering as well. So like in a totally separate conversation, I think she could be a great Barkley contender one day. But a lot of the American audience sort of tracked Claire Banworth's season last year. And I feel like in some ways, Emma Stewart is like a modified, lesser but equally impressive version of Claire in the sense that she's multifaceted, can do a lot of these just tough races. And I don't know if she'll quite have the speed necessary to like contend for a win, but I could see her as like a podium contender for sure.
Yeah, I also had her name down because I noticed her Snowdonia result, and that's definitely like kind of the extremes of of technical terrain in terms of like ultra running technical terrain. And yeah, I think she can definitely be up there too. She definitely has like, she has like pretty consistent results that I would say. I think it's just interesting to see that there's a lot of women around the same, at least on paper, like around this same sort of level. And I think that's going to be an interesting part of the women's race is like this podium through, kind of like that middle top 10 positioning. I think it's going to be pretty tight.
I'll give you my podium prediction. So I've got Courtney for the win. I've got Emma Stewart in second, and I've got Claudia in third. What do you got?
Oh, I would say Courtney, Claudia second, and then if Azara finishes third, but Azara is quite unpredictable in whether or not she finishes. When she finishes, she does very well, but she often chooses not to finish. Third, man, I don't even.
You can lock in your fantasy free trail picks.
I'm going to say Ida just because she's my teammate. Man, there's a lot of, not just because she's my teammate, but I think she can do that if she, I think she can do that if she manages a smart race without going too wild at the beginning, which I don't expect her to anyway.
Last up, we have the men's field, and I've got a whole list of notes here to report on. But first, I have a question for you. So I think the biggest recent news around this field is that Pau Capel, Benyat Marmisol, and Jim Walmsley will not be lining up. All three were strong contenders here. I think the Americans that are listening will be particularly curious about Jim. Do you have any context on why Jim pulled out that can be publicly shared?
I don't have like details. I think he was just making sure he was like really ready to get back to trail running. That's sort of the like gist I got. Otherwise cool. We can wait until he wants to share whatever his reasoning is. But yeah, it would have been really great to see him here. I'm sure he'll want to come back someday.
Yeah, cool. As we said earlier, the men's classic, this 126K race has never been won by an American on the men's side, and many have tried. This year, it's a good delegation being headlined by your teammate, Zach Miller. other teammate Seth Ruling. There's a couple people that I want to run through that I've taken notes on that I think are strong contenders for a podium here. The first is Shen Zhongsheng. He should be pretty familiar to this audience after his 2023 season, second at CCC last year, fourth at Western States, which is an amazing double. Stocks on the rise, coached by Jason Koop. He was here last year. He DNF'd the race. I think it could be the case that the race just sort of got away from him last year. I think he was with Andrew for a lot of it. But, he's 1 year wiser. I think based on Instagram, it looks like he did come out ahead of the race this year to do a bit of recon as well. I love that kind of preparation. So Shen is one to watch out for. Obviously, Zach Miller, if you just look on Strava, he hit this 4 to 5 week stretch in January where he was running 24 to 32 hours a week. He was climbing upwards of 40 to 50K vert a week. He was eating a ton. Just the amount of work he was putting in was staggering. And it makes me grateful as a fan that we have Strava to witness all of it. And I feel like he kind of lives up to the mantra where it's like, if you're running an ultra marathon, you have to be ultra prepared. And so he definitely kind of lives that out. The one question I always have with Zach, although it hasn't always bit him, is he selective enough about when he puts that big of a stress on his body? It looked like he took a decent rest after that massive buildup to his rim to rim attempt. So I think he's in a good place. But I think anytime you get to those levels of volume and total workload, you're always kind of playing with a little bit of fire, and you're kind of stepping into the unknown. Seth Ruling, I think winning is within his capacity as a runner. I think the only question I have for him is the distance. I think he's very well proven at 80K and 100K in the mountains. Can he extend it to 220K? I actually chatted with him on Instagram before this episode, and I was like, dude, what are your thoughts on the course? He's like, it's exciting. He says it's not as technical as he thought it was going to be. He said it's super hot, but he's happy that a lot of the race is going to take place in the night and early morning. Couple others here that I want to mention. Andreas Reiterer has had a lot of success at CCC in the past, a lot of success at the World Trail Championships. He's podiumed at Transgrancanaria. I think he's one of the very best in the world. He podiumed at the 73K race here last year. You have Andrew Simon, who won the race last year. The only question mark I have with Andrew is he can be hit or miss in terms of either landing on a podium at a race or DNFing. And then I think there was one person that our friend Tyler Green wanted me to really emphasize, and that was Miguel Arsenio, who got second here last year. Tyler was just blown away by how he executed that race. You and I are both fans of Aurelian, and I mean, he beat Aurelian at the Maxi race last year. I think this guy is super strong. I think he's a contender for the overall win, and I love that he has experience here. So, I mean, I could name 30 people on the men's side, but those are just a few that I want to put on people's radars. Do you have any comments there or any additions?
I think you hit all of my... I actually didn't know that Benyat wasn't here. He was kind of someone I listed down as to watch to see what he's up to. Yeah, I would say for me, it's the cool thing about Shen and Seth being here. They've raced each other at CCC and they both went out quite fast. I'm really interested, and Zach, all three of these guys we know like to go fast from the start. And I think that's going to make this a super interesting dynamic because for sure somebody's going to be going quite fast from the gun. And then it's going to be interesting to see how the race evolves around that. If they stay at the lead, if there's some types of explosions, I think this is going to create a really interesting dynamic. I'm not sure if Seth is planning to go fast from the start. I just know he did that at CCC. Shen for sure is always running quite fast, and knowing that the race starts fast, I think kind of plays to his strengths a bit. He's quite a good runner's runner. I'm not sure, actually. I don't think I've seen, of course, I know that Zach has won like JFK in the past, and can match that like high speed, but I actually haven't, I'm not sure if he's run any longer races that aren't as mountainous in the last, since he's come back from injury. So
I got to check that as well.
I don't have a
Yeah.
great sense of like where he's at with that. But of course, as we talked about, like that first section, I feel like it's where you could lose the race almost. So maybe not being in the front pack there is working for your benefit, to just be like more with it later when it seems like the moves matter a little bit more. But yeah, I think that's going to be interesting. And then of course, like the whole Spanish contention, super strong. Yeah, I also was going to point out Miguel. Well, there's two Miguels, but Miguel Arsenio, who did beat Orleans at Maxi Race. And we should also remember that Seth Ruling also beat Orleans at Maxi Race in 2022. And this is really like, I don't want to like, Orleans is a fantastic runner, a good friend. But this is like really his home race. So to have someone come and beat you there is like kind of saying quite a bit for that other runner. And yeah, so Miguel Arsenio, definitely someone to watch out for. His Instagram profile says he's 27, so let's go with that. And he looks like I would say his social media vibe is very fun and very, just fun. So I think he seems like a cool person to know. And I think he'll play definitely into the dynamic of the race. He for sure has a ton of experience from last year. Andrew Simon also, he's, as you said, hit or miss a little bit like Azara on the women's side. But yeah, I think that, especially as we were talking about, like, I think for the Spanish runners, it's almost, it feels almost like if you're here and you're Spanish, it's almost like you're operating on a different level than everyone else. One, because it's sort of, I mean, you have the home language advantage, which is something to keep in mind. Like when an American, for example, shows up here and doesn't speak Spanish, like me, it doesn't feel as comfortable as if you're in a race and everyone around you is speaking your language. I can say from experience that when I started to learn more French, I felt much more comfortable and confident, like during races, when you, not even at an aid station, but just the feeling that you kind of belong there, like you can communicate. And it's these kind of little like comfort things that do make a big difference in longer races. So yeah, that was all just to say. And of course, the race is a huge deal with the Spaniards. So I feel like when you're doing a prediction for this race, you kind of have to give some like bonus points to the Spanish. And of course, I mean, Miguel Arsenio is Portuguese, but similar kind of culture. So you kind of have to give them some bonus points, because I think they're coming with a little bit more behind them almost.
Who are your podium picks on the men's side?
Oh, I have, wow. I think I'm gonna say Miguel Arsenio, because I think he's just gonna be a fun guy to watch. Shen, if he can execute until the end, and Zach, I think the combination of experience and kind of past confidence. I feel like when you're coming from a place of confidence from good results, you kind of are able to keep the momentum going a little bit more, maybe. But there's also like, I mean, Seth is going to be in that mix. But it's going to be hard to, I think there's going to be a lot of moves made, and it's going to be whoever makes the smartest decision for themselves that ultimately takes the higher finishing position.
Yeah. I think it's really tough because I think there's probably 10 guys in my mind who belong on the podium. I also probably need to check my American bias for Zach and Seth, who I think could win this race on any given day. But 2 of the last 4 years, there's been an American on the podium, so I feel like it's reasonable to go that route. I'm almost identical to you. I've got Shen winning the race, Miguel second, and Zach third. So that's my podium.
Yeah, I also have a huge North Face bias, obviously, with Shen, Zach, Seth. Yeah, Pau just had, well, his wife just had a baby last week, so that's why he's not here. But otherwise, of course, another North Face teammate favorite.
Very cool. Well, Katie, this has been a pleasure. For the audience, if this preview has either incited or renewed excitement for the race, go check out the live stream. I believe the race starts Thursday or Friday. I don't know what the time conversion is.
Friday at 11:59.
Okay.
So
maybe
I guess
Thursday
it will be
evening in America.
It'll be Friday morning, I guess.
Okay, gotcha.
Or afternoon. Yeah. But yeah, they'll do a good job with the live. They'll have tons of camera runners and plenty of places to watch.
Make sure to go put in your fantasy free trail picks as well. And yeah, Katie, thanks again. Hopefully we can do this again. I'm looking at our upcoming schedule, like maybe Madeira, and then I think Grand Ray would be fun too. So a couple more, hopefully.
Islands. We're just going with an island trend.
Island track.
Great.
Cool. Katie, thank you so much, and have fun at the VK.
Yeah, thank you. I keep forgetting it's tomorrow.